this video, I'll be demonstrating how you can use the Waves C6 plugin to enhance your kick drum and snare drum tracks on electronic song. So here's what I'm working with. As you can see, I've got one version of C6 inserted on my kick drum track, and that's shown here on the left, and another version of C6 inserted on my snare drum track, and that's shown here on the right. What I would like to do is use these plugins to process these samples of synthesized drums that are a little bit boring on their own, give them more excitement, and help them sit better in the mix. Next, let me talk about the approach that I'm using with the C6. One way to think about using the plugin is just as a multiband compressor or expander, where essentially you divide up the frequency spectrum into different regions and then compress them separately. A slightly different way to think about using the C6 is actually as an equalizer, specifically as a dynamic equalizer. Now, what do I mean by that? As an example, let's take the kick drum that I want to process. Let's say, for instance, I want to EQ the transient or the attack of my kick drum one way, but then for the sustain of the kick drum, I actually want to EQ that slightly different. With the C6, you can do precisely that. Let me show you one way of doing it. Let's say, for instance, you want to bring out some of the snap right at the attack of the kick drum. With a conventional plugin, what you would usually do is go in and sweep around between 1500 hertz and 3000 hertz and find where you are adding that little bit extra snap in. So what I've done is use this floating frequency band of the C6 on my kick drum and found right around 2300 hertz that's the part that I want to bring up. So I'm using it as an expander to increase the amplitude, shown here. Then I have a very fast attack and a very fast release. What this is going to do is just during that attack portion of the kick drum, I'm going to be increasing right around 2300 hertz. Then what I've done is taken this third frequency band that goes from 715 hertz up to 11,000 hertz. What I've done is used a slightly longer attack time that's after the release for the this floating frequency band. So I use a longer attack time and then a much longer release time that's going to actually decrease the amplitude then of this frequency region during the sustain of the kick drum. Next, I'm going to do the exact opposite with the low frequency part of the kick drum. So I start out with this low frequency band with a fast attack time and a fast release. Right around the fundamental frequency of the kick drum, I'm going to decrease the amplitude because I don't want those low frequencies muddying up the attack of my kick drum, but I want them to come back in during the sustain, right where the fundamental frequency is. So then what I'm doing is using this other floating frequency band right around 65 hertz, where I'm going to use it as an upwards expander or increase the amplitude here with a long attack that's after the part that I'm compressing here, and then a much longer release, such that throughout the sustain of my kick drum, I'm actually going to be increasing the amplitude. Lastly, I use this second frequency band here that goes from 170 hertz up to 715 hertz. This is kind of the boxiness part of the kick drum that a lot of times with a conventional equalizer, you just scoop out that part. So what I'm doing with the fast attack and long release throughout most of the kick drum hit, I'm just decreasing the amplitude by using the compression part here with -7. So let's hear the kick drum in action on its own. So it is a very subtle effect that I'm doing, but it's adding a lot in the context of the mix. Let's look at the snare drum. It's basically the same idea, except with different frequencies. So I found for the snare drum, right around 1500 hertz is the part of the attack that I want to enhance. So fast attack, fast release, that transient, I'm going to be boosting these frequencies. And then again, with this frequency band, I'm going to be decreasing the amplitude throughout the sustain of the snare drum hit. Just as before, I found that basically the Fundamental frequency of the snare drum was just a little bit below 250 hertz, closer to about 188 hertz. And so I'm boosting the sustain here and turning down the attack with these two, the floating frequency band and the low frequency band. And again, I'm taking out some of the low mids between 250 hertz and 700 hertz with this frequency band. Finally, I'm using this high frequency band above about 6,000 hertz to add some extra sparkle and air to my snare drum hit. I'm doing this by increasing the amplitude throughout almost the entire duration of the snare drum hit. Next, let's hear this drum in action by itself. And that's all there is to it. I'll go ahead and play it out again so you can hear the processing in the context of the mix.